Okay, welcome back, kiddos. Now we're moving on to 3.3 proofs of parallel and perpendicular lines. So what that means is how can we prove that lines are parallel or perpendicular given what we learned last time? Okay, so let's look at this. It says decide whether there is enough information to prove that M is parallel to N. Okay, so that's what this means is M is parallel to N. Okay, so what we want to do is see if there's enough information to prove that. If so, state the theorem that we would use. So we're looking at our paper that we had from last time. Okay, so we're looking at that green piece of paper, and let's take a look at this right here. Okay, so they're asking, can we tell that line M and line N are parallel? Now, one thing is I know they look parallel, right? But here's the thing with geometry, we can't just go on looks. We have to prove it. So what do we know? I see this angle and this angle, and they both have just one arc, right? So if this just has one arc, that means these are congruent. Okay, so if those are congruent angles, how are those related? Well, if we remember, if this is a transversal, this is in the same corner, right? So these are corresponding angles. Okay, corresponding angles. And what do we know about those? That they are congruent. Okay, and what do we say congruent means? Congruent means same measure or equal measure, right? That's what congruent means, is that if we measure them, they're the same. All right, so what do we know? Are these two lines parallel? The answer is yes. Why? Because the corresponding angles are congruent. Right? How do we know they're congruent? Because this just has one arc, right? If it has one arc, that means this is congruent with that. Well, if two lines cross a transversal and this is equal to this, then they have to be parallel. Okay? So, hopefully that makes sense. Let's look at this one. This will make even more sense, I think. They want to know, is M and N parallel? Well, what do we know? We see that this one and these are vertical angles, right? And vertical angles are congruent, right? They are congruent. So we're asking, is that enough to prove that this line and this are parallel? Are M and N parallel? They may be, but we don't have enough information. So because the answer is no, because we have no info on N. Right? We don't have any angles that are related to N. That's why we don't know. So that's all we can do is just go on the information that we have. Okay, so let's get into some deeper practice with some algebra now. It says find the value of x that makes M be parallel to N. Explain your reasoning. Okay, so let's look at this first one right over here. Okay, so if we see that this is a transversal, right, and it's crossing these two lines, are these parallel or not? Okay, well, we can tell only if this angle and this angle, right, those would be what we call those corresponding, right? So we could say line M and line N are parallel only when, you could say only when the marked corresponding angles are congruent, right? So if these are congruent, that means these are parallel, right? We talked about last time, if these are parallel, then these are congruent. Now we're working backwards. If these are congruent, then these have to be parallel. Well, how do we tell if those are congruent or not? They have to be 8x plus 55 has to be equal to 95, right? If they are congruent. For them to be congruent, that has to be. So let's go ahead and solve for that. So if we solve for that, we're going to subtract 55, right? Okay. So we have 8x equals 40. Divide both sides by 8. That means x equals 5. Okay, so what that says is that line M and the line N are parallel when x equals 5. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Okay, those are parallel only when x is 5. If x was not equal to 5, then say x was 0, right? If x was 0, that would be 95 equals 55. That wouldn't be true, right? X has to be equal to 5 for these lines to be parallel. All right, let's take a look at this one. Thinking about that same thing, what are the relationships between these two? This one is on one side of our transversal, right? And this one's on the other side. Okay, so we could say that these are parallel when we know that the relationship is true, right? So line M and N, right? Lines M and N are parallel when the marked what angles? What are these angles described as? Okay, they're on alternate sides and they're on the outside, right? So we're going to call those alternate exterior angles are. And what would you say? Those are congruent or supplementary? We said congruent, right? So if this is congruent equal to that, that means these would be parallel, right? We said if these are parallel, then those are equal. Now we're going to check it. If this is equal to that, then those have to be parallel. So let's do what we said, right? We said this one has to equal that for it to be parallel, right? So let's solve for each angle, right? So if that is 200, we want to move that to the other side, right? So we think, what's the opposite of 200? Negative 200, right? We're going to subtract 200 from each side, right? So that cancels out. So negative 2x equals negative 70, right? Then we'll divide both sides by negative 2, x equals 35. Okay, so that means lines M and lines N are parallel when x equals 35 degrees. If x does not equal 35 degrees, then those cannot be congruent. Now, one thing we can tell if these are congruent or not, this is greater than 90, right? It looks like it's greater than 90. That is greater than 90. We talked about it. If they're both greater than 90, in this scenario, they have to be congruent. This is greater than 90, right? This is definitely greater than 90. In this scenario, they have to be congruent. They have to equal each other. All right, so now let's look at this problem right over here. This is a higher level one. Find the measures of these two angles. This is one measure, and that's that. Just pause the video, see if you can get that on their own. Okay, well, what do we know? This angle and this angle are on the same side. Okay, so we're going to call those same side, and they're on the inside, right? So we're going to call those same side interior angles. And same side interior angles are supplementary, right? Which means they add to 180, right? So we would say x plus 2x equals 180. See if you can solve that. This is a little sticky for some people. All right, if you got stuck, it might be because you overlooked that 1 right there, right? So that would mean 3x is 1x plus 2x is 3x equals 180. Divide by 3, that means x equals 60. Okay, so that means the first one is 60. 2x means 2 times the value of x, which is 60. So that's equal to 120. So our two angles are 120 degrees and 60 degrees. All right, so hopefully that makes perfect sense because we know that those are alternate interior angles if these are parallel. All right, so now let's go into a proof. Okay, so a proof is, we talked about how we can prove it that this is true. So these are a lot of symbols, so let's work through this. This is our given. It's saying that angle 4 is congruent with angle 5. Angle 4 is congruent with angle 5. Well, if this is a transversal, what do we know about those two angles? Those two lines, right? We need to prove those should be parallel. We got to prove that. How can we prove that? Let's start with our reasonings, right? So angle 4 is congruent with angle 5. How can we say that? Well, we remember that was given to us. That's always the first reason. So that's always first reason. It's what's given to us, all right? So if 4 is congruent with 5, what else do we know? Okay, if 4 is congruent with 5, right? What do we know about angle 1? Angle 1 is congruent with angle 4, right? Angle 1 and angle 4. So angle 1 is congruent with angle 4. Why? Because those are vertical angles, right? We know that vertical angles are congruent. Okay? So then it tells us the third step is the transitive property. Remember, transitive means if 5 is congruent with 4 and 4 is congruent with 1, then that tells us that 5 is also congruent with 1, right? Angle 5 is also congruent with angle 1, right? Because if angle 5 is congruent with 4 and 4 is congruent with 1, that means 5 is also congruent to 1. That's our transitive property. So if this is congruent with this, that means G has to be parallel to H because these two are corresponding angles. And if corresponding angles are congruent, that means the two lines have to be parallel. All right, so hopefully that's making a lot of sense to you. If not, just let me know or ask a neighbor. So make sure that we got that down before we move on to our next page. All right, so let's look on the second page then right over here. All right, keeping that in mind, we're going to use this information in on our other one to answer these questions. So on the first one, which angle number represents DGA? So let's trace that out, DGA. Okay, DGA is D to G to A, right? That right there. Which angle number does that represent? That represented by angle, this number 3, right? That's that angle. So angle DGA is angle 3. All right, simple as that. Next, because we're trying to prove it given the information you have. Which angle number represents the angle vertical to FHC? So let's trace out FHC first. So FHC, right? FHC, because we know that H is right there. Okay, vertical. So we know vertical angles look like that, right? So if we're looking right here, we also want to look like right here, right? So we're talking about which angle is that right there, right? Is that, oh, that is what we're looking for, right? Which angle number represents an angle vertical to that? So we would say that angle 6 is vertical to angle FHC. All right, let's keep it moving. Which angle number represents the linear pair? Which angle number, the linear pair of TYW? So a linear pair, we remember, looks like that. Okay, that's what a linear pair looks like. Okay, because we know that it adds to 180, right? They add to 180. Let's do this. Right? We know that adds to 180. So that's what a linear pair looks like. Okay, so it says which one to TYW. Let's trace that out. T to Y to W. Okay, so we said it's going to look like this, right? So it could be like this, right? Or it could be like this. Okay, so which one is it? Is it this one? Or is it this one? Okay, well, they said which angle number. If we did it like this angle number would be 5, right? If we did it like this angle would be Y. So since they want a number, it's 5, right? So we would say angle 5 is the linear pair to angle TYW. Angle 5 is a linear pair to angle TYW. All right, let's keep it moving. Which angle number represents an angle adjacent to LSP? Remember, adjacent means shares a side. Okay, so which angle number shares a side with LSP? Let's trace out LSP first. L to SP to P, right? LSP, because that's S right there. All right, so shares a side. Which angle shares a side? So this is one side, right? This is another side. So this angle right here shares it, right? So we can think, is it this one right here, or is it like this, right? Is it like this? Is it that one? Okay, so which one shares a side? Well, it needs to be a number. Okay, over here, right, this one is a letter S, right? That shares this side. This one sharing this side is a number 5. So we would say angle 5 is adjacent to angle LSP. All right, nice. Let's keep it moving. Next, if the measure of angle AGD is 37 degrees, if AGD, let's trace that out. AGD. Ooh. That whole thing right there, right, is 37 degrees. What is BGC? BGC. Let's trace that out with a different color. BGC. Well, what do we notice about those? If we look at it, it looks like line right there, right? So if this one is 37, this one also has to be 37, right? So the angle, so since vertical angles are congruent, so measure of angle BGC equals 37 degrees, right? Since we know the vertical angles, right, they have to be equal. All right, let's look at this last one. Okay, if the measure of NSM is 100, NSM, let's try that out. NSM, right? So that one right there, if this angle is 100 degrees, what is MSP? Let's trace that out with a different color. MSP. MSP. Ooh, what do we notice about those? What I do notice is it looks like that, right? And so those add to 180, right? So if those are supplemental, right, that means they add to 180. Okay, so that means angle NSM plus angle MSP equals 180, right? So that means I would just do 180 minus 100, which would equal 80 degrees. Okay, so since that's true, that means that's our answer, 80 degrees. All right, so if you have any questions, just let me know. You got this.